Hideaki Anno's Neon Genesis Evangelion was groundbreaking in the 1990s for being the first anime story that mixed religion and presented it in a different sort of way. At least it was in terms of America. As it later turned out, or at least as I later found out, the weird religious symbolism that was overly prevalent in Eva was an organic continuation of Anno's obsession with classic Ultraman, which had weird random religious symbolism. Alright everyone, welcome to my second video on Shin Ultraman. My last review video for Shin Ultraman was my kind of on-the-spot reaction to the general joy and spectacle of the movie, where Ultraman punches the big monster so hard, and the summary of the plot therein. Now if you haven't watched that video, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. You should definitely not watch either of these videos if you haven't watched Shin Ultraman. That being said, I put all the spoilers in the other video. This video won't have as many spoilers, but I guess it's going to have spoilers for Shin Gojira, and I guess it will still have a few spoilers. Anyway, I'm writing this new video a few days later now that I've had time to calm down and speculate on what the deeper meaning behind the movie was. So here's what's what. In 2016, Shin Gojira comes out. Shin Gojira literally reduces me to tears because it is simultaneously the truest Godzilla film since Godzilla 1984, the first Godzilla movie I ever saw, with the sad Dr. Pepperman and the... Yes, I see. And underneath that, it was a pitch-perfect criticism for the satire of the Japanese government's mishandling for the 2011 Dai Tohoku earthquake and the resulting tsunami, Fukushima meltdown, and everything happened that week, from the inaction of those in charge, the corporate greed of those in the highest places of power, and each stage of Godzilla directly represents a phase of the Tohoku disaster. And I should preface that this means a lot to me personally, because in 2011 I was a transfer student living in Japan, and I lived through all of these events. The insane wet Kamada form represented the tsunami, the weak red form represented the 1954 Godzilla, but also the government's inability to stop a time-sensitive but easily stoppable threat, and the final devastation brought about by Shin Gojira in its final form was a representation of the Fukushima nuclear disaster and the unstoppable death and chaos that came with it. Now, what's going to follow is my very controversial opinion on Shin Ultraman. First things first, I think Shin Ultraman is a literal sequel to Shin Gojira. I think literally Shin Gojira attacked Tokyo in 2016, and 6 years later, Shin Ultraman happens. Now, some people are going to argue that Shin Ultraman is just a stylistic or thematic sequel, but for a bunch of reasons, I'm going to point out that it's a literal sequel. For starters, the film literally starts with the title card saying Shin Gojira, and the first thing that shows up on the screen is Gomez, a weaker Godzilla relative. Also, the SSP's formation seemingly is a continuation of Yaguchi Rando's group of random outsiders who had to come up with creative ways to deal with Godzilla. Since that worked for Godzilla, I'm sure they could have thought of the same way to deal with these other monsters. In fact, one of the monsters, I forget the name of it, I think it's Pagos, is defeated the same way as Shin Gojira. Now, on top of all this, since the movie was made by the same team of people, there's a strong musical consistency between the two films. Both films include the song Morning from Tokyo, playing in roughly the same context and roughly the same spot. Both films also borrow music from each other and Neon Genesis Evangelion. So, if Shin Gojira was actually about Fukushima, then that begs the question, what is Shin Ultraman really about? Well, Shin Ultraman is the story that is told from the perspective of two different government groups. The SSSP, whose only job is to defeat alien kaiju, and the Japanese government, who is initially working with the SSSP, but as the movie goes on, they begin almost ecstatically kowtowing and bargaining to the various intelligent aliens that arrive in Japan as the story continues on. So I guess this is slightly historically similar to the way the Japanese government has always given in to American ideals over the past 2 centuries. Since America showed up in Japan with superior technology, they're kind of used to being invaded by people with superior technology. Now in the film, the government pretty much surrenders on the spot to Zerub, despite the fact that Zerub is very sketchy, and he ultimately turns out to be a kind of fascist dictator. Then after Zerub is killed, Mephiles shows up, And Mephiles is seemingly even worse, although a little bit nicer. I guess people were more eager to trust Mephiles because he was a handsome, happy guy. But just because he looks human, he still has this authoritarian surveillance atmosphere where he kind of seems to be spying on everyone and you're not really sure how he's doing it. Now, once again, dialogue in the movie draws out the direct parallel criticism in this situation with Japan's current pacifism and its reliance on America for protection. Now, when I first reviewed Shin Ultraman, I thought the story was doing itself a disservice by seemingly having too many very similar villains with the same premise dropped one on top of each other. Like, thematically speaking, there could have been and should have been just one villain. And if I'm really being honest about it, I think Zera probably could have been taken out of the movie because he undercuts Mephiles as being the same kind of political threat, and he undercuts Zophi with the same kind of evil Ultraman shtick. But now that I've had a few days to stew on it, I'm kind of more convinced that what the movie was actually going for was that Mephiles was probably a satire of the previous Showa Emperor of Japan, or otherwise some modern Japanese religious fascist I've never heard of. And Zera, meanwhile, was a more stereotypical god dictator-like figure like the Kim Jong of Korea, and maybe then Ultraman himself as Jesus. Alright, so that's even more to unpack. Let me just start with the Jesus stuff, because I've gotten very desensitized to the idea of Superman as Jesus because Zack Snyder's been pushing it like way harder than anyone ever has pushed it lately. But I always kind of ignored the very strange and very retroactively obvious symbolism as Ultraman as Jesus that is very prevalent throughout Showa era Ultraman. Now, I never really thought too deeply about why Ultraman was always being crucified. I kind of thought it was mostly just a bad set design or someone's bondage fantasy playing out in an inappropriate way. But now we have Shin Ultraman, and Shin Ultraman is the first movie to point it out that you have to contemplate that since Ultraman died and came back to life, is he like Jesus because he was crucified like Jesus? Is Ultraman Jesus? I don't know. As much as they're implying those things don't actually happen in Shin Ultraman. They happen in the old Ultraman TV show. However, in Shin Ultraman, the main religious conflict is that Mephiles shows up and all he wants to do for humanity is to be accepted as the one true God. While meanwhile, Ultraman wants to save everyone on the planet from all these alien threats, and he's a kind of savior in his own right by literally saving people. So Mephiles' name comes from a corruption of the word Mephisto, who is the devil, and also, Mephiles was Mephisto. The bad guy was Mephisto. Anyway, so Shin Ultraman, not about Fukushima, because it's 2022, no one cares about Fukushima anymore these days, right? So instead, Shin Ultraman is asking very lofty questions, and they all have to do with God. Some of these are very literally asked out loud in the movie, and some of the others are kind of implied, but they all seem to be: who decides who God is? Are superheroes the new gods? Are political rulers our gods? Are aliens gods? And is Ultraman a god? Now, let me take a second to mull over all these. Who decides who God is? That kind of is on you. The people decide who God is. God is decided by the people. So in that case, are superheroes the new gods? If the people decide they are, they kind of are. At the same rank, are political rulers our new gods? I would say no, but fuck, people are so pissed off these days about literally all kinds of politics. So just stew on that one, because that's a head scratcher. Are aliens gods? Well, the History Channel would like you to think so. And lastly, is Ultraman a god? No, he's not. He's an alien. Shut up. Anyway, so Shin Ultraman seems to be about the religious reckoning between the public's fascination with religious deities, superheroes, and at the same time, the public's faking fascination of religious deities for various political, socio-economic reasons. So, more to the point, Shin Ultraman is kind of a long overdue reckoning with the Japanese political religious state. To sum it up simply, if Shin Gojira is a perfect reboot of the 1954 Gojira, while also being a satire of Fukushima, then my best guess is that Shin Ultraman is a satire of the Emperor of Japan. Not the current emperor, though. Naruhito seems to be a pretty cool dude. It's more like the old school idea of the Emperor of Japan being a god, and that's another heavy topic that we have to unpack. So, for a lot of the backstory here, I'm diverting to Japanese researcher Shogo. He did a super cool video on the history of government/religion in Japan and how for a while they were intertwined. Like literally for centuries, the Japanese government used religion as a tool to manipulate farmers and poor samurais into accepting the shittiness and the bleakness of their lives. But to boil it down faster than he did, eventually the Japanese Shinto religion, which was originally all about respecting nature, got all fucked up when Buddhism came to Japan from like India and China. Now the shoguns did not like Buddhism because it like reduced their control over the poor population. And up until this point in Japanese history, only rich people in Japan went to heaven and had afterlives because poor people didn't get to have that. They just lived and died, and that was fucked. Meanwhile, Buddhism came along and it completely turned that system on its head because it told the commoners that, yeah, they can go to heaven, they just have to think they will. And so all of a sudden, poor people were going to heaven and now they didn't care if they died. So they rose up against their shogun warlords and they killed them all. So a lot of people died from that. Wow, religion, yeah. Now, this ultimately culminated in the Meiji era where the state decided to just make up their own damn religion to stop the corruption and reorganization of Buddhism and combine it with Shinto practices. And so the Japanese government came up with its own state religion called Kokushinto, aka State Shinto. Now, Kokushinto was basically presented as both the reality of the world and also the state's law. And at this time, they drew a direct link between the Japanese emperor being a deity, literally descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu with this like phony family tree, and it was revised a bunch of times. But long story short, if you read it all over, it means that the Japanese people are the one chosen people of God, literally descended of God, and literally every other group of people from every other country are dirty, hairy, insect monkey people who must be exterminated. And that is how we got World War II. Now, after that, the American government forced the Emperor Hirohito to sign a ridiculous document called the Human Declaration Order, where he had to embarrassingly admit that Kokushinto was bullshit and that he was a flesh and blood human. Hence the Human Declaration Order, he was ordered to declare he was a human. I feel like we need that order for some other people. Anyway, so you would think that would be the end of it, and you think it would all stop there, but recently in the past 10 to 20 years, there have been some weird flare-ups in Japan as the far right in Japan has been trying to revive Kokushintoism as a means to the end to remilitarize Japan, disconnect it from, its neighbors, establish it as an empire again, and bringing Kokushinto back also bringing back the institutionalized racism that it is built upon. So that's not good. Now, I think this history has kind of made the Japanese people very wary and wise to religion, as it was consistently used as a weapon against them for almost the entirety of Japan's history. When I first moved to Japan, I met a random man traveling from Africa, and he described the Japanese as cold, self-centered atheists without mercy or hearts. Now, I don't agree with him, but the fact of the matter is that Japan has the largest atheist population in the world. 62% of the population identify as atheists, although some have claimed that this number is inflated because a large number of the population are just too shy and don't want to tell you what their religion is. It's also interesting because Japan is one of the busiest countries in the world, so maybe the Japanese are just too busy to have a religion, but it also just kind of brings home that, by and large, the Japanese have been constantly conned by con men pushing religion on them. So, again, that's exactly what Mephiles does in this movie. Higuchi in this movie definitely seems to be on the fence about Japan's place in the world and how militarized Japan should or should not be to deal with global problems. But at the end, boiling it down, what Shin Ultraman is ultimately about, the overlying theme of the movie definitely seems to be that if someone says they're a god, fuck them. I'm not saying the movie is anti-religious, it's just saying fuck someone if they say they're God. And fuck you if you're using God as a carrot to control people too, I guess. Oh, and bringing it back to what I was getting at the start, Anno just confirmed that this movie is a literal direct sequel to Shin Godzilla because there are direct connections with the music cues, and also Yutaka Takenouchi appears as the same minor government official in both films. Cinematic Universe! Alright, well, that concludes my review of Shin Ultraman. See you guys next year for Shin Kamen Rider, which we already know from the poster is actually about cults. Oh god, I'm gonna love talking about this one. See you guys next year! Subscribe.